You will never meet a giver that's poor. But I didn't grow up with money at all. I didn't have running water in my house where I grew up. I would have to take buckets to a well.
Lesley Kuffour, he's parlayed that into a real estate empire of multi-million-dollar real estate.
The number one important thing for me was, on top of hard work, was just
we're in this world of AI emerging everywhere, and there's a lot of fear. For someone like you with the technical skill set, with the experience, leading teams, having investments, operating businesses, what do you see as next?
as a business owner, you should be looking at, how do I...
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to Office Hours for Practice Owners. I am Justin with Marti Law Group, and I am so very excited to welcome our guest today, our client, our colleague, my friend, Lesley Kuffour. Lesley, I don't know where we begin to kind of introduce you, but I would like to take a step back before I kind of throw the mic to Lesley for a moment, because I think today's episode is a little bit different from what we normally do, talking about transactional points and M&A and things to look for in a commercial lease, right? Very important stuff that a lot of our guests will bring to the table and that our clients and listeners and viewers want to know about. But today's really not just about transactions. I think it's much more about mindset. And again, when I started thinking about this episode and what we wanted to kind of do, there was nobody who came to the forefront of my mind greater than Lesley, frankly. So we've been blessed to work with Lesley throughout parts of his journey. And this is an individual who started in Ghana with, very little resources. I'm going to let him tell that story, but came to the US and truly I get chills when I talk about it because of what he's been able to accomplish. He obtained multiple degrees. He has incredible technical skills that just blow my mind when he starts to nerd out on some of the technical stuff that he can do. He's parlayed that into what I would call a real estate empire or a growing empire of multi-million-dollar real estate holdings, multiple businesses. So I remember one day we had lunch and he was ready to pivot into kind of the SMB, the small, medium business world, and begin doing acquisitions. And since then, we've been fortunate enough to help Lesley acquire a few businesses now. And we've got some other things in the works that, we'll talk about at some point, hopefully. Lesley was recently featured on Hartford Business Journal's 40 Under 40, which is just incredible to hear more about in his journey and what inspires him. And so, again, I want to have this conversation because the mindset behind his journey is something that, regardless of if you're a healthcare practice owner or a home health owner or a fitness center, whatever your business is, or maybe you're aspiring to get into it, the mindset here is really, I think, what makes a difference. So Lesley, that was a long introduction, but let me throw it to you and thank you for joining us. And if there's anything you want to add, please feel free.
Thank you, Justin. You're far too kind. I appreciate that. Those are some incredible choice of words for me. Very, very kind. I appreciate that. And yeah, I'm excited to have this chat with you. You and I always have great conversations, and I think today will probably be another good one. So looking forward to it.
Awesome. Well, so without further ado, I guess if you can take us back, because even I don't know kind of the full story of Lesley and how we got to where we are today. I know life started very different for you in Ghana. So can you take us back on that journey, kind of where you began into getting in the US and kind of what that journey was like?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm from Ghana, born and raised. I moved to the States, I don't know, maybe about 14, 15 years ago, right before college. So, when I had a good upbringing, my grandma raised me. My mom had me when she was very young. She had the opportunity to travel and sort of pursue some economic opportunities and kind of help us back home. She did that as best as she can. And while she was away, my grandma raised me, and God bless it that she's no longer with us. I certainly wasn't born with a silver spoon. And I didn't grow up, wealthy or rich or anything of that sort. But my grandma was incredibly resourceful, and she cared a great deal about how I was brought up and making sure that she was doing her best to help facilitate me with any opportunity that she could. And so, I know growing up, the neighborhood that I grew up in, the friends that I had, we all sort of had the same economic background. We had the same sort of public schools that we went into. But but at some point throughout sort of my upbringing, my grandma and certainly when things started to sort of somewhat get better for my mom, and as she could, they were able to kind of help explore some of the private schools and really focus on giving me some the best education that they could possibly afford, right? And I didn't have, my biological father in my life growing up. And so it was just really those two ladies. And I'm eternally grateful to them for going above and beyond and doing more than at any given point, they would be able to make sure that I was presented with the best opportunities. I mean, I'm talking about my mom and my grandma literally selling garments of clothing they have to be able to afford tuition for me to go to school, right? And I was always aware of that. Two things that were very clear to me growing up. My grandma would always let me know how bad or good things were. And she would always let me know, sort of what the real cost or level of effort was to get me or afford me those opportunities. But in conjunction to that, my grandma at a very young age would always tell me and would sort of instill in me the potential that I have, how great I could become, and how much help or how much value I could provide for my community. My grandma was extremely instrumental in sort of helping shape the mindset that I grew up with and what I have now in terms of just speaking, what we call speaking life into me in terms of having limitless potential. And so I always had that growing up. And so all of the opportunities that I got, I took them extremely serious. I was very serious in school, as best as I could be, because I knew two things. A, as my grandma would always tell me, it cost them a lot to put me in those positions. And then B, I had such a great potential ahead of me. And the only way to take advantage of that potential was to take those opportunities very serious. And so fast forward, I was very, very fortunate to be able to be accepted into an international community school. This school was essentially built to, from my perspective, to target a lot of the international folks, sort of the expats that lived in Ghana, that worked across the mines and all of these other sort of large corporations that were foreign owned. And so, the school was set up in a way with a curriculum that would train their kids to essentially get ready to take, different types of exams, A levels, which is like the British curriculum level, SATs, for their kids to be able to sort of, go back and go to colleges and universities in your home countries, right? So that was an incredible opportunity for me in high school. And one of my closest friends, which is another crazy story, him and I have been tight till now. His name is Kofi. He was a couple of years older than me. He took the SATs, did well. He was able to get a student visa to travel to the States. And he did that. He attended university here. After his first year, he came back to Ghana. I mean, I was a junior in high school at the time. And I remember we had dinner. He took me out for dinner to sort of catch up. And he was like, Lesley, I think you absolutely have what it takes to take the SATs, get a good score, apply to some colleges, possibly even get a scholarship. And so you should get ready for that. And so he said, rather than wait until senior year, how about you give it a shot now and consider it as a mock exam, right? And so when the results come back, wherever you have some weaknesses, you can improve upon that and get ready for senior year and sort of maximize your chances of being able to get into a college in the United States and be sponsored for a visa. So I said, all right, let's give it a shot. I took the test. I did well. I did really well. I don't remember what the score was, but I did well. And we had a counselor at the time, Miss Jocelyn, or I think that's her name. She said, yeah, I'll help you get a feel for college applications. Let's give it a shot. I applied to 2 colleges. Both of them accepted me. And I was like, I have 3 years of high school transcript, right? And so I still have to get in there. Like, no, we've looked at your transcript. We've looked at your SAT scores. We think you're academically ready for college. And so, here's your invitation for the student visa. And so I took advantage of that. I went to the American Embassy, applied for my visa, which was, another story in itself, because initially I was denied for the visa, but I was incredibly persistent. And I remember when I went for my interview, the counselor at the time essentially looked at my paperwork, looked at everything, and they're like, yeah, 3 years transcript, it's not making sense. Give us 30 days. We're going to deliberate and get back to you. So I left and I went home. And this was around May 2012. So I'm home, 30 days go by, 60 days go by, nothing, right? And so at that time, everyone was like, look, if the American embassy tells you to go home, they give you your passport back, that's effectively a denial, right? But I felt like, look, I didn't get a denial letter and I don't believe that it's final. And so I remember my mom at the time was like, Lesley, it's not time yet. It's okay. You gave you your best shot. You're capable of it. So let's go back, finish senior year and then give it another shot. But I just felt it very deep in my heart that, and I don't know if it was faith, but I just felt like I should see that through and at least close loop, right? And that's the type of person that I am. I don't like to leave things open-ended. So long story less long, my mom sends me money to go get groceries and provisions or whatever the case may be to get ready to go back to school for board, because it was boarding house high school. I take that money, I book a bus, and I get on a bus for a 4 or 5 hour journey to go to the Capitol where the embassy is. I take my old interview appointment letter. I show up to the embassy fully ready to explain to the security that, hey, this is an old invitation letter or appointment letter, but this is why I'm here, right? But as my faith and my luck would have it, the security personnel looked at the interview, the appointment letter, and didn't realize that it was a different date, right? But he looked at the time and the time matched, the exact time that I showed up. So he gives me a ticket and I say, okay. I go in, I sit down, a few hours go by, and a counselor calls me up and she's like, we've kind of gone through the entire list and we're not seeing you. We think we've exhausted everyone that we're supposed to interview. Now, what's your name? Maybe we got something wrong. And so I begin to explain to her what happened. And so she looks at me, she looks at her computer, she says, young man, you were denied. But my story and the persistence that I showed, she was very impressed with. And then she said, give me your passport. She took the passport and said, come back tomorrow for your visa. And that's how I ended up getting my visa. And when I got the visa, it was I would say about a week before I was due to start college in the States. So I actually didn't go back to my home city. I stayed in the capital. And I told my grandma, my mom, they didn't believe it. I sent them pictures. My grandma packed some stuff for me, sent it over. My mom got me a flight. And the next day I was out of Ghana, and the rest is history. So that was the journey up all the way until I got my visa. Finally made it to the States. I drove straight down to West Virginia to start college. And the rest has been history. I started my sort of journey as a college student and never looked back. And I've sort of, full throttle since then till now.
That's incredible, man. I'm telling you, every time I talk to you, I learn something new. And this is a guy, for everyone who's listening, who just met with the mayor before he hopped on to this call. So just to put in context, I think he has a little bit of determination in him to get things accomplished. What do you think, Lesley, what motivates you? Like, what motivated you? I sense family, right? And of course, like, that's so hugely important. There's some drive though in there that's gotten you from the start to now. And what do you feel like that is?
I don't think it's like one specific thing. I think it's sort of a combination of a lot of different things. So I'll take it back to sort of growing up, right? So I grew up, and I think I was a little bit more sort of reserved in this statement earlier, but I didn't grow up with money at all. Right. But I was fortunate enough to experience how folks on the other side live. And I'll tell you how exactly. The first experience of that for me was, so my biological father is from a very wealthy and prominent family. His great uncle, which is his mom's brother, was the president of Ghana for about 8 years. Right. And I have that last name, too. And whenever I would visit that side of the family, I have an aunt that's also passed now. She was great friends with my grandma, and she always did her best to pull me into that side of the family and make me feel included. And so I'll spend some summers with them. Certain family events I would be invited, and I'll go over and I would experience sort of how they lived, right? And I think that was sort of a sharp contrast between my day-to-day life with my grandma and how I was raised. And again, my grandma did the best that she could. She really did the best that she could for me. And she was incredibly hardworking, incredibly resourceful. And every single opportunity that I've been afforded in life has been because of her and my mom, right, to an extent. So But it was still very challenging, right? It was extremely challenging. I mean, I didn't have running water in my house where I grew up. I would have to take buckets to a well and grab buckets of water to bring back to the house for us to have water to shower, to cook with, right? So that's how I grew up. Sometimes I would go, 2 weeks at a time without no electricity. And so I had, that's how I grew up, right? But on the flip side of it, I got to really experience, just really how folks that are wealthy live, right? And at a young age, you can almost imagine what that does to you, right? So I always had this sense that I want to create this life for myself, but for my kids and for my lineage. And I think that with sort of how my grandma spoke to me, right? With how she sort of ingrained it in me that I was capable of achieving anything. I firmly believe at any given point that regardless of the little bit that we had, I could become whatever and anything that I wanted to be, right? And so I think in the early stages, having sort of that sort of juxtaposition was a great opportunity for me to kind of know how the folks live on the other side of the fence. And I always wanted to create that for myself. I think that was the first one. The second one was kind of really affirmed when I got the opportunity to go to that high school that I told you about, that boarding school. I mean, these were, all of the kids that I went to school with, majority of them, very few of them came from similar background as me. Majority of them came from extremely well-to-do backgrounds, parents or engineers or like prominent business owners or ministers or owners of like large factories and mining. It's just incredibly wealthy folks, right? And I was in boarding house with their kids. And I got to, every weekend they would get visitors. And of course, I'd get a visitor like maybe once every 2 months, right? They would get a visit on weekends. They would have food, stuff prepared for them, brought to them. And I kind of got to experience how they lived as one. And I think that was a similar experience to how I grew up and kind of really, beginning to feel like, okay, well, this is definitely and certainly the life that I want to create. And so I think, and I don't know, what to call that, but that was the early inception of sort of the ambitious Lesley, I would say, right? And that's how it really started. But to that note, and I always say right now, my entrepreneur journey or Lesley as a business person, I'm kind of in the center of community and people. I've always had this idea that it's extremely important to be value driven. It's extremely important to focus on delivering and being a net positive, on having a net positive impact on my community. And I think I came from my grandmother as well, because as little as we had, she always prioritized giving back first, right? I'll give you an example. I remember, so growing up in Ghana, we didn't have, consistent, electricity, public electricity. And so we had this rotating cycle of when we would have power, and it would be like 1 week on, 1 week off, right? And my grandma, at one point, she would make a little bit of money. And I remember she bought a generator for our home. And we were so excited, right? And when she bought the generator, we were like, okay, no more lights out for us. Even when, our neighborhood loses power, we're going to kick the electricity, the generator on and have power. 2 weeks after my grandma bought the generator, she donated it to an orphanage. All right. She ended up buying another one. A few weeks after buying that one, she donated to a church, right? Because she felt like for her, if there were a lot more people that were in a much more greater need than her, it doesn't matter that she worked very hard to acquire that thing, as long as she's being able to give back, improve the lives of many more. She was incredibly selfless. And I can give you countless stories of that. My grandma had very little, but then she would still adopt, tens of kids at the school of blind and deaf in a very poor region and then fund their lifestyle. I mean, I'm talking about we would be penny pinching for her to be able to do that, right? And so I think growing up with that in mind, I've always had it in me or I've always had a top of mind to sort of be in this intersection of people and community and giving back. And I've always believed in this saying that, and I heard this for the first time from my grandma. And so I don't know if it's her thing or it's, but I've always heard that, I've had it ingrained in me that you will never meet a giver that's poor. And I've been very much so, I felt like a lot of the incentives that I get, a lot of the success that I get, I've sort of had this tight correlation to moments and times where I gave back. And so before we started this, you and I were talking about, a recovery housing project that I have here, a nonprofit that I started a few years back. That nonprofit that I started, I started that nonprofit. I bought a single family house. I renovated that property out of my pocket with my friend Gavin. And we did that work even long before I bought a place for myself, right? I bought a home with the intention of providing a structured, sober living environment for folks to live through before I even thought of, buying a home for myself. At the time, I was living in my mom's basement, believe it or not, right? And that's something that we can talk about later too, this whole concept of delayed gratification as well. But the opportunity to be able to really give back and be a pillar in my community and have a net positive result in the community is very, very important to me. And so all of the business ventures that I've been a part of has also had, have had that element to it as well. And so I think, there's a lot of different things that motivates me. And I think there are a lot of different things that makes me ambitious. And I think all of those are in there. And of course, it helps that to be able to have, money and really do good for not just myself, not my family, but my community as well.
It's incredible to hear the story. And it makes so much sense, I think, in the journey that at least we've been able to kind of watch you go on and in buying, a vast amount of residential units and kind of build, in and around your community, right? Like where you're located geographically, elsewhere as well, but really to kind of build up that community and build the sober house in that community and you live right in that environment. And, a big part of what I recall is the church, or I think your family is involved in the church there. And then you went on to buy, a home health organization, which again, really allowed you to thrive and help other folks thrive in that community. So I mean, it sounds like, it makes total sense because it truly is the core of what you are and, how you've become how you are.
Yeah.
Let's pivot to that actually. So you're a college kid. At what point in time are you like, I'm going to start buying, because a lot of to take a step back, a lot of our clientele, they're providers, they're healthcare providers. They work very hard to put themselves through schooling and achieve whatever their dream is for themselves. But, they are sitting in a place now where they want to take the leap. They want to go buy that practice that they see, or they want to hang their shingle. And it's funny, as you and I know, right? Like as entrepreneurs, it sounds great, right? Like you don't have to call anybody if you're going to be late that day, or you got to head out early to take your, we're both girl dads. I'm also, I guess, a boy dad, but you got to take the kids somewhere. Like you don't have to let anybody know. But at the same time with that, right, comes tremendous responsibility. And so when I talk to some of these younger folks who are looking to buy a practice or buy a business, I'm like, it's going to be great. It's also going to be really freaking hard and very vastly different than you could ever expect. So take us back to, I don't know if it's during college or after college, but what was that first acquisition you made and what was the vision? Because clearly, you've just continued to run with this thing and buy units upon units and then do awesome things with those units.
Yeah. So great question. Great question. I'm like a big picture, big vision guy. I have friends, tons of friends, not just one or two, a lot of friends from college that would tell you that everything that I'm doing now, I would speak to back then. Right. And so I remember freshman year, I went in my second major. So I was a double major. I went in my second major to be in, I think it's business entrepreneurship, right? Something like that, because I always knew I wanted to be an entrepreneur. And I always knew that my degree in STEM would help me develop high paying skill sets that would yield high paying jobs. Mm-hmm. I always knew from day one that would be a stepping stone, right? That was the means to the end, not the end to the means. So essentially in college, I had this vision that I'm going to get through college. I'm going to get these 2 degrees, 1 degree in STEM and sort of in the information systems world, which led to my IT career, and one with the business management and administration marketing world, which I knew would be very, very critical when it came to sort of, the entrepreneur dreams and the vision that I had, right? I was a very serious student in college. I was incredibly serious about just making sure that I was maximizing the opportunities that I had because I knew where I came from. And a lot of the potential and a lot of the things that I knew would be either extremely difficult to achieve or impossible to achieve, all of a sudden became clear that it would be extremely possible once I moved to the States and started college. And so I didn't want to give up that opportunity in any way. I didn't want to mess up in any way. So I took it very, very serious. And since day one, I knew that I would get a degree, I would get a job in engineering, and I would save up a lot of money from that career and I would leverage that into real estate. And that was exactly the plan. And that was exactly how I followed suit with it. And so I graduated in 2016 in West Virginia at Fairmont State University. And then I moved. I was fortunate enough to get a job at Wayfair, which is an online furniture retail company. I think probably one of, if not the biggest in America now, but a global company. And I started there in my engineering career. I was a frontline systems engineer in 2016. And my friend Kofi that I mentioned earlier, that sort of helped me, kind of say, okay, I'm going to take the SATs. I'm going to look to really, go to the States. He graduated college about a year or two before me and started his career as a software engineer at Wayfair in Boston, right? And so that was another sort of parallel in our life. And he was the one that actually, presented Wayfair to me as a potential opportunity. I applied, long story was long, got the job, moved to Boston. Both him and I had similar ideas. I was actually really convincing him, hey, we have good paying careers now. We can go get apartments, right? But how about we figure out a way so I told him, right, I remember when I moved to Boston, I said, look, I could get an apartment, but I don't want to. What I want to do is 12 months from now, I want to be able to start investing in real estate and I want to be able to start parking some of this money elsewhere so that I can start to create revenue outside or income outside of this 9 to 5 and then begin to sort of just have equity and ownership in something outside of this job, right? So that I can sort of have, not be completely and wholly dependent on a paycheck. And he bought into that. And I said, how about you and I go rent an apartment and we figure out, a way to kind of really hunker down on our number one, monthly, sort of largest monthly expenses. And he was like, you know what, Lesley, I like the idea, but I'll do you one better. I have an aunt that lives just right outside of Boston, and she would love for us to rent a bedroom and we would stay there. And I said, good, let's do it. So we reached out to his aunt. We ended up renting an apartment, a bedroom, which he was actually already staying there looking for an apartment. But he changes that plan. We rent a bedroom. We're paying $500 a month. And so, it was an incredible deal. There was one bed and him and I would take turns sleeping in the bed on the floor, literally. I could have afforded to get a nice luxury apartment back in 2016, $2,000 a month downtown, somewhere and have a very comfortable life. But it was like, no, screw that. We got a goal. We got a vision. We have to stick to it. We need to delay gratification, short-term pain, long-term gain, right? And we stuck with it. And exactly in 12 months, I had saved about 80% of my take-home pay. And all of that went into my first deal, which was a duplex that I bought in Connecticut. And I strategically bought in Connecticut because two reasons. A, families in Connecticut. I have this local community in Connecticut, obviously, church, everything. But then it had a much lower barrier to entry, right? For me to buy a duplex in Boston or the surrounding Boston areas, I needed to come up with about $100,000 plus in down payment, equity injection, closing costs, all of that stuff. But Connecticut just felt like the right opportunity. And so I did a lot of research and looked into possibly just the local, both micro and macroeconomics, where I could bet on long term. And, I decided to invest in Vernon Rockville. I liked what was happening at the time. Vernon Rockville was sort of kind of at the very early stages of, the local government really looking into really investing into the local businesses, providing a lot of incentives for businesses to come in, allowing people to build, develop more housing. But it was all talk at the time. But for me, that was enough indicator to say, you know what, I'm going to bet on this. And I did that. And so, I bought a duplex. The duplex had, a basement that was 1,000 square foot basement. I renovated the basement. I would go to work in Boston, work all day, 8 hours, drive back to Connecticut, 2 hours, And then I would lay flooring, paint, whatever the case may be, all night, right, at this duplex. And I rented it, made decent money from it. I would say about 8 months down the line, the duplex had built good enough equity. And so I did a cash out refinance. I pulled money from it. I added a little bit more money from my salary to that. And from there, I bought two more deals. Hard money lending was a big thing. This whole BRRRR thing strategy was a big thing. I bought two more deals in 2017. And I think that's when we started working together, actually. I think your office helped me close on those two acquisitions. I bought a foreclosure for $100,000, another property for $80,000. Both were, multifamily properties. And I spent, between a combination of hard money lending and some money that I had saved, I spent on renovating a property. When I was done renovating a property, stabilizing it, renting it, I was able to cash out refinance in both of them, pulled out north of six figures. And again, that was basically the start of it. 100% of that money plus more, what I was still saving from my salary, went into just buying more properties, renovating, and I just kept rolling, and I've done that same thing all the way up until now. And I think, I might be just a few doors away from about 100 apartments. We're actually doing our real estate schedule this week. And so I'm looking forward to kind of get a good pulse on where we are unit count wise. But that's essentially the same model. And I just doubled down on it, replicated it, and I've done that. And all whilst doing that, I maintain my career. I work through, that job at Wayfair, various different positions as an individual contributor, all the way through leadership and management. And I eventually became the head of global IT operations. Whilst working there, I had teams sitting in Germany, in England, in North America. That was an amazing opportunity for me. And Justin, I could have left Wayfair, quite frankly, around like the 2018, 2019 area. But I decided to stay with it because as I got into leadership, I was actually getting a firsthand experience and what I thought was very critical and necessary for what the next step was for me in my sort of entrepreneur journey. I was a part of a Fortune 500 organization that was operating at a very high level. And I had the opportunity to lead a global team and kind of fast track my development as a leader. I was incredibly blessed to serve under some leaders, Todd Wheatley, whom I'm still very great friends with. And I was able to learn from those guys, was able to kind of really pick up a lot of skill sets that I've been able to leverage now in building my businesses, building a leadership team to run those businesses. And I stuck with it. And, of course, the salary was very helpful in being able to sort of, fast track my growth in my entrepreneur career as well. And I stuck with it. But I think, throughout sort of my, call it 10-year career in the IT business while still bootstrapping and working really hard to spin up my real estate portfolio as well as the businesses that I was able to buy and start. The number one important thing for me was, on top of hard work, was just delayed gratification. Because at any given point, I could have scaled back and I could have taken a pause. But I was able to delay on a lot of different things, which really was sort of important in fueling this sort of engine that I've been able to kind of build and now, be at a point where I'm fully transitioning away from corporate America. But some would say that I've done it, maybe about a year or a few years too late because I'm now at a point where that career is costing me a lot more and the opportunity cost I keep onto it is not worth it. And so hence, now beginning to make that pivot and move away from it. But that's how I went about things. And it wasn't easy. I would say on average over the past 10 years, I've worked probably 80 hours a week on average, right? And that's what it's taken, sacrificing a lot of vacation time. I take a vacation from one job, and that vacation time is spent on building other businesses or construction work or whatever the case may be. And so I think delayed gratification, being relentless, never taking no for an answer, following through, failing forward. I think those have all been sort of these guiding principles that I've kept forefront and have led me to this point.
It's incredible, man. I mean, the journey is incredible and what drives you. I think the idea of delayed gratification is something that in this country and maybe around the world, but particularly in this country, as you've probably have seen, is a hard concept for a lot of folks. I know my first business I built up when we had a group of dental offices, and I was like, I'm making money, I can, spoil myself, and it truly limited my ability to grow as quickly as I wanted to, and it took me now, I'm in my mid 40s and realize, oh, wow, I could have probably done this and this different to accelerate the growth. So the learnings that you brought, or I mean, even that you're bringing to us today are like, invaluable. What do you, I know like I could listen to you talk all day long and kind of tell us these incredible stories. What do you see as the future? And what I mean is, as you look into your crystal ball, right? We're in this world of AI emerging everywhere, and there's a lot of fear and there's a lot of excitement, and probably depending on your role, lawyers, right? They're really nervous because suddenly everyone's doing their own documents on ChatGPT and they're getting their own legal advice and medical advice, right? And these professions that were like, I'm invincible, right? Like they're always going to need me. It's an awakening, I think, for a lot of folks to think about, okay, is my skill set going to make it, in 100 years from now? Is this the industrial revolution of our age, right? And so for someone like you with the technical skill set, with the experience, leading teams, having investments and operating businesses, like what do you see as next? And how does that also, I guess, as a second part, maybe frame where you go from here as far as your endeavors?
Yeah, that's an incredible question. So as leaders or organizational leaders, our job is to part of our job, or folks would argue really the main job is to be able to aggregate resources, and those resources to be able to execute on whatever directive that you're setting forth, right? And then provide an environment for them to thrive and be successful in. And so how does AI and all of that fits in there? I think obviously everyone has your own goals, visions, how they plan to sort of, run your businesses and where they're going. But so I'll speak from my perspective and how I'm seeing all of this and how I'm leveraging it. So at this point, Justin, we're talking, close to about 100 apartments across a few apartment complexes, some standalone multifamily buildings. The home care business that's still in, pretty well, 7 to 8 figures in revenue. Obviously the fitness business and some stuff that we can't disclose yet, but another business venture that we're looking at about 7 to 8 figures in annual revenue as well. And people always ask me, Lesley, like, how do you manage all of these things? How do you run with all of these things? And I think for me, I've always seen myself as I'm not an operator, right? I always tell this to my general managers and folks that I work with or folks that work for me is, I'm not here to work in the business. I'm here to work on the business. I'm here to be able to focus on long-term growth strategy and vision so that we can execute the tactical stuff underneath that as part of making it from sort of, point A to B, or what the path to green is, right? And so to circle back to your question and what AI means, I think for me, it becomes a part of the resources that I'm aggregating to help move us forward under this framework that I'm working underneath, right? And so I'll give you an example. When I bought my home care business a few years back, we had a couple people that were working in HR, and we had folks that their entire job was 100% recruited, right? Because in home care, it's a high volume hiring job, right? And so I remember, I was looking at, when I bought the business and kind of was diving into it, I said, what is our conversion, metrics, right? How many people do we need to get to submit an application to be a caregiver for us to be able to hire X amount of people? And let's look at what that conversion value is. And we realized that, okay, for us to hire about 10 people a month, we need to have about 500 applications. Well, how can you possibly handle 500 applications all the way to the downstream? Because 500 applications means, doing phone screens on about 80% of them and then getting about 60% of them into sort of, the first interview, and then getting about 40% of them into, to be accepted, and about 20% of them to show up for orientation and training, about 10 of them to stay and actually, right? How does that funnel all the way down? And then you realize that there's a lot of this mundane, repetitive task along the way that doesn't require solutions engineering, doesn't require to think about what the solution is. It's just more so 1+1 is 2 things, right? And so I said, okay, well, how about we look into really documenting and standardizing the mundane, repetitive steps? And if we can do that, perhaps we can look into automating some of that work. Long story less long, we were able to identify, okay, well, for phone screens, we're spending 15 minutes to talk to each applicant, and we're asking them the same 10 questions. And the 10 questions are yes or no answers. And so we don't need to have people sit on a call. And so we were able to, at the time, I reached out to some software companies, and I was able to stumble upon one. We were able to work and introduce a tool, which was an AI tool. And this was 3 years ago, by the way. And so we were very early and ahead of it. And we were able to implement this tool. And guess what it did? It allowed us to be able to go from being able to process maybe about 100 phone screens in 1 month to 100 phone screens in not just 1 day, but 1 hour. Because now you're not relying on an individual person making these phone calls. You have an AI tool that is conversating with people, that's having a conversation with people via a chatbot and text message. And that system is integrated with our recruiter's calendar, and it's helping schedule appointments, confirm appointments, and things of that sort. And so what it does is we were able to standardize what the process is, and we documented it, and we're able to automate it with the AI tool. And so now we're able to do more with less. And I think it's a use case for me as a business owner, my approach to how I'm using AI currently, right? So I always use this analogy, Justin. If you work 8 hours a day and you get paid, you make $10,000 working 8 hours a day, and I say, hey, I can show you this tool that can make you $10,000 an hour. You're not going to say, okay, well, I'm not going to work 8 hours a day. I'm going to work 1 hour and make 10,000. You're going to say, okay, well, I'll work 8 hours a day using this approach and make $80,000 a day. It's the same thing. I don't think that at the very least, all of the doom and gloom about AI replacing jobs necessarily is a real thing. I don't think we're quite there yet. I think we may get there when we get to say AGI or super intelligence. But I think for now, as a business owner, you should be looking at, how do I enhance my productivity gains with AI, right? What are some of the things that we have always thought of doing and we wanted to do and think would take the business to the next step, but we just didn't have the resources and the capacity to be able to do that. I think I would encourage all business owners to start to think about those things again and how they can use AI to solve it. And I think that will begin to sort of point folks in the right direction, right? But there is a foundational piece that I think is very important, and I think that business owners needs to be very clear about, which is that for you to be able to introduce some of these systems, some of these AI tools to be able to achieve higher levels of automations, for you to be able to entrust a system, a tool, an AI tool to do things for you, I think we're at a point where AI is not coming up with net new solutions very well, right? I think that's going to be the super intelligence era. But I think right now, all it's doing is, even some of the agentic AI, all that it's doing is just basically taking this prescribed information, right, and then executing on that. And so I think a lot of business owners need to look at, really standardizing and as best as they can, where they can, coming up with these cookie cutter solutions and standard operating procedures, documenting them well, getting those done, at the foundational level, and then seeing how they can layer on top AI to kind of take that sort of documented, systemized processes and then running with it, because it's kind of set. And the AI just runs with it, right? And I think that's where I would encourage folks to look at. And I think that will help set people up foundationally to be better primed for a lot of where I think, we're going in the future. Because I think that right now, a lot of us are seeing just the early, very surface level of AI. And I think that what AI could bring in the productivity gains it could yield and a lot of the success we could see from it, I would say that's what businesses should look into doing. Small businesses, mid-sized businesses should look into doing to be able to get ready to take advantage of that future, right? Which is, hey, like just standardize your processes, build SOPs, documentations, right? Figure out where you can afford to be cookie cutter. Where are the mundane, repetitive things that you're doing now? Document that and figure out how to systemize it. Have, people that are appropriate be responsible for it. Start to layer the AI thing on top. And I think it'll get you ready for what the future is as far as AI and technology is to come. And outside of just even AI, just the whole fundamental idea, look, foundationally, we need to systemize. We need to put together what our standard operating procedures are. We need to be able to have documentation. I think those are all critical to like even business continuity, right? You have someone in one role, they leave, it's easy to train and upskill and put someone in there because you have standard practices and operating procedures that are documented that they can get into and go. To roll it into how I run my businesses, that's how I'm able to not work in the business, right? Because we have agreed upon standard operating procedures. We know what we all need to be doing. I don't need to micromanage on what that looks like. And I can hire the best and smartest people to carry out those SOPs, get out of their way, facilitate an environment for them to be successful in, and have them drive it, and then hold them accountable to the end results, through KPIs and things of that sort. And I think for me, that has allowed me to be able to kind of scale. And I think that, as I look into long-term growth strategies, buying more businesses, as I'm a big franchise guy, buying more businesses, more, franchise units. I think that's my focus, right? How do we make sure that, all of the repetitive, mundane tasks, we are standardizing how to address them, layering tools and AI tools to take over them. And the individual folks that we're running with those processes, if they were able to do 10 tasks, let's see if they can do 50 tasks with that now, right? And start to get some of those productivity gains. And we're seeing some tremendous growth in a lot of different areas of my businesses with that approach.
That's amazing. And I mean, what you're saying is it's funny because my team, probably my wife, make fun of me because I'm always saying systems and people. Systems and people will drive everything we need to in our businesses. And it really, again, home health, a real estate portfolio, a law firm, a dental practice. I still think those same core principles apply. So it's really cool to kind of get your insight and hear how you're already layering on some of those tools. Lesley, I could ping you with questions all day long. I know you've got a million places to be and people who are in line to see you. So I would love to kind of wrap and ask if there's any parting words that we didn't even talk about, the actual businesses. So if you want to provide us with, information, contact info, or really anything you want to kind of leave us with, I think people would be super grateful.
I'm a realist. I try to see things for what they are. I'm incredibly hopeful for the future. I think the future is incredibly bright. Obviously, there are a lot of things going on out there, right? That could be quite demoralizing, but I choose to have the perspective that the future is incredibly bright because I am solely responsible for, what that future looks like. But that said, and as much as I am an optimist, I have a sort of an optimistic view. I tend to think about things and try to see things for what they are. And I don't look at things for, what I want them to be or what I fear it could be or don't want them to be. And I look at them for what they really are. And I think that has allowed me to kind of really be convinced and convicted of the idea that there is truly not much or really not anything out there that can't be achieved by just setting your mind to it and kind of, having that big picture on whatever that thing is. But as long as you're able to sort of reverse engineer that into like, what is the next small achievable step, right? What is the next small step that I can take? What is the next incremental step that I can take, I can drive through and kind of chip away at it. Over time, when you look back, you're going to realize that you've made a ton of progress and you're inching closer to what that is. I think no matter how difficult it may seem, I would encourage folks to just not to get too much into the weeds of what the future could look like in terms of, conflating that with what is actually real in front of them, or just being overly analytical about how bad things could go, and even sort of holding themselves back from being able to take action, execute, and just say, you know what, this is what I want to be. This is what the reality of the current situation is. And these are the small steps that I'm going to start taking. And I think, and I firmly believe that little drops of water makes a mighty ocean. So you just have to start with that little drop and keep going. And before you know it, you'll find yourself in that mighty ocean. And so I think, that would be my parting ways to folks. I'm not a very public person. And so I would just mainly probably plug my businesses. If you're looking for an apartment in a central Connecticut area, call our property management, 860-977-7117. If you're looking for home care or home health care services for your loved ones in the northeastern section of Connecticut, look up No Home Instead, Northeastern Connecticut. If you're looking for a place to go to and sort of embark on a fitness journey, Total Health Club in Bloomfield. If you're looking for recovery housing, I'll look for Hillstone Recovery in Vernon, Connecticut. And yeah, more to come, and excited and thankful for this opportunity, Justin. And yeah, thank you.
Likewise, man. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing the knowledge and for the time. You truly are, people talk about a pillar to the community, and you are that, man, in what you're doing. So thank you for the time. Thank you for trusting us to help you with a lot of the transactions. And, I look forward to the future together.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you very much. Likewise, sir. Thank you.